everyone. My name is Sally Stein, and I'm the Director of Public Programs for Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary with National Audubon Society. And I want to welcome you all to our first virtual Lunch and Learn today. And the title of this program is Giants of the Swamp, the Logging History of the Big Cypress. And this will be presented by Cesar Becerra, who is a noted historian and author. So thank you all for being with us today. We're happy that you're here. We just have a couple of things to go over. You probably noticed when you logged in that everyone logged in listen-only mode. We do have a chat function. Usually this is at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions throughout the program, feel free to type those in the chat box, and you can see what that looks like with the little icon at the bottom of your screen. So at the end of the webinar, we will have a question period for Cesar to answer any of the questions that you pose there, and we'll try to get through all the questions before the end of the program. We also, in about a week or so, will have a recording of the webinar available on our website. We'll also email this webinar link to everyone who's attended today. All right, without further ado, we'll go ahead and let Cesar get started with this program.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Audubon. Thank you, Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. It's if any of you all listening have not been there, it is really, without a doubt, a gem. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir. It's not just for birders and nature folks, but also there's a lot of history that doesn't always jump out at you, but this particular talk is hopefully interesting, exciting, but also kind of gory and sad in a way, because it is the documentation of some serious destruction that could have, in the end, really done up, you know, the beauty that is at Corkscrew, but luckily that wasn't the case, and we'll get to that. I'm going to start my lecture by just saying, if you can just put me back one more time on the, I got a prop here I just want to point out, but there was a story, an anecdotal story that went that two gentlemen were canoeing in the Big Cypress, and they came across a hat that was floating around on the swamp floor, and one of them reached down to grab the hat and said, "Wow, look at this hat. I'm gonna get me a free hat." He reached down, grabbed the hat, and as he pulled the hat up with swamp and muck and all that, out came a hand and a face and a body and grabbed that hat back. And the guy was kind of like stunned, and they said, "What are you doing there?" And the gentleman in the water that grabbed the hat back said, "Listen, I've been logging Big Cypress out of the swamp for 10 years now, and this is the best footing I've found yet." Now, although the actual story sounds preposterous and massively overblown, we'll actually have a few photos here later to show you that, in fact, sometimes to get a firm footing, you had to literally get in not only the swamp and not only waist deep, but sometimes chest deep, and on a few occasions, believe it or not, go under the water to finish off, topping off a log that had been felled down to the cypress swamp floor. Just a crazy, interesting, and wild story. The first slide that we'll get to is me out 25-ish years ago in 1993. I was, I say I won the lottery. I was chosen to be an SCA, Student Conservation Association researcher at the Big Cypress National Preserve, and there wasn't any rhyme or reason to what the subject matter was going to be. There was a list that the Big Cypress wanted to kind of look at, and one was farming, and one was development and hunting and what have you, and one was logging, and I guess it just popped out. But it was as simple as, you know, I'm interested in that. Maybe it came from going many, many moons ago to Sequoia National Park and seeing the giant redwoods. And up until that moment in time, I had only probably been to Corkscrew on one occasion, but I definitely was impressed with the size of these trees. The building you see me sitting next to is a building that was actually built of Cypress lumber. This particular building was at one of Baron Collier's wayside stations across the Tamiami Trail. And it was the one directly across from Big Cypress Bend boardwalk, which also has some pretty amazing, massive trees. So Corkscrew's 300 some odd or 290 some odd giants that are still around, of the big mammoth variety that are just so big you can't wrap your even mind or hands around it. There's still a few of those outside of the park in the Fakahatchee of that girth and that tall and bigness, and those are at the Big Cypress Bend. This building was one of the many buildings that were there over the years, but it was definitely built to cypress. And there's a lot of buildings in the area, such as in the town of Jerome and the town of Copeland, which we'll get to soon, that also were built of cypress lumber, particularly Pecky cypress lumber, which was a cheaper version of the high-grade red leaf cypress Tidewater without it being Pecky. And Pecky was just back then, looked like it was worm-eaten and not too, smoothed out. And it was just kind of trash wood. And Sears catalogs would actually sell you a kit for a house, generally done with Pecky cypress because it was cheaper. Today, Pecky cypress is worth its weight in gold. The next slide is a kind of a historic slide, probably not shot in the Big Cypress, but in the cypress swamps of Florida. And that was a really wide, you got to really have a wide berth of what that meant. Originally, cypress logging would only strictly take place alongside any rivers or streams or big areas where there's a lot of water, particularly the St. Johns River and different rivers, Okefenokee Swamp time, areas that had enough water that you can actually easily get in, sometimes with a boat, and get to that Big Cypress, fell it on the very sides of those rivers and float it back, and then eventually they would be carried up into the, eventually down the river. Later on, you had to go out and get, as that cypress lumber was depleted, rail lines were put in to different cypress swamps around the state of Florida. Eventually, they would go into the very last place in Florida that really had the giants, and that was the Fakahatchee. One thing you'll notice if you look very closely at this photograph, and we're pretty sure that this is probably in the Fakahatchee, you'll notice that just below the piers of the ties that go across those rail lines that you see there is literally, we're in the swamp. And there were times where they would take advantage of a stump being at a certain height and cut it right then and there and put the tie right on it. Other times they would cut anything and everything they could possibly get their hands on and just throw it down on the ground and put the ties, especially the spur lines. The main line was usually graded, meaning they would actually dig a canal and put some dirt and muck and rock and get it above that. But the lines that went off the main line are about every 120 or so feet, or 240 feet, I believe, were these spur lines that went off the main line. Those they weren't about to expend a lot of energy, a lot of money. So they would, and they weren't going to be there very long, maybe about a month to go in there and clear cut some of the big trees, and then once, or girdle them and come back after they were dry and then cut them down, and then with powerful winches bring them out to the main line. But they weren't about to go ahead and actually build massive grades everywhere. So we have photographic documentation that actually shows a royal palm, a gumbo limbo, other smaller cypress tree just cut and haphazardly the line placed right on those. That wasn't always the case, but in a couple of photographs, yes. But imagine one thing that you have to understand looking at this photograph, to get the big cypress trees out of the swamp, you eventually were going to need some pretty heavy material. But if you know anything about swamps and you know anything about heavy materials, tonnage and tonnage, those two usually do not mix. So the fascinating thing about steam-powered locomotives at a time in our history where we had already predominantly switched over by the late 1920s into diesel power. The Big Cypress, the Fakahatchee in particular, was one of the last places, or the last place, where steam-powered locomotives were operating at a level that was impressive. In fact, some of the operations that were working there would buy any steam locomotive anywhere in America, and just to bring it down there to skeletally, mine them for parts, because they weren't making any new parts. So you had to literally sometimes have other engines that you'd strip, because some of these engines would break down, and you couldn't just go tap in on a computer and order a part, and Amazon would bring it out the next day. That was not happening. You had to literally, in some cases, sometimes these locomotives, as in one account by Frog Smith, who was a pioneer, later journalist, but actually worked for the C.J. Jones Lumber Company, told us that they would actually sometimes topple in the muck at high times of water. And there were times that they couldn't even right the locomotive. They would literally bring the line and go around that particular locomotive and just start scrapping it for parts. So a huge, huge process. So this shot is the Fakahatchee for sure, I can tell you. You can see some beautiful royal palms in the distance. A lot of people took advantage in the late 40s, mid 50s, going out there while all this was happening. And occasionally they would actually allow you to run out there with the gang. And actually, there were a lot of photographers that did go out there, luckily and unluckily, because it's kind of a terrible view. But look closely, you can see that some of those ties are not your standard squared off ties. Those are literally just logs in some cases. You can see the ebb and flow, that they're not exactly squared off. So a lot of spit and polish out there, whatever it took to get it done. And here is now the gentleman in this photograph is very integral to the process of logging. Now, the land itself was owned by the Collier Corporation. They would lease it out to different entities. In this particular case, the Lee Cypress Tidewater Company. In another case, everything from in Fort Myers, the Dowling Camp Company, to Jerome, the C.J. Jones Lumber Company. And they basically, the part of their lease was they would get paid per board lumber of timber that you would remove from the cypress. So this gentleman is probably a representative from the C.J. Jones Lumber Company or the Big Cypress, Lee Cypress Tidewater Company, and is measuring the girth of the tree, the length of the tree, etc. And you can see this car here is what we call a skeletal car. And so this is basically, there's no sides. This is maybe two different side arms that would hold on. But you can see this one car alone is probably hauling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 8 logs. These are massive, massive logs, big time. And here's another dramatic shot, probably most likely Jane Scenic Drive of these steam locomotives. This particular one, we believe, is probably a Baldwin 262. And again, there are all different types of locomotives throughout the Big Cypress. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the process of getting this particular lumber out of there. By the way, this particular one is owned by the Dowling Camp, which was a sawmill that existed in the outskirts of Fort Myers. And you can see them going over kind of a soft spot, kind of maybe a low slough area. As you can see, there's kind of like a trestle bridge type effect there. But look, as you look down, and every one of those logs in that photo represents a tree that could have been 400, 500, 600 years old. And we want to caution the rumor mill of, for many, many moons, there's been this kind of adage that the cypress trees that were out there grew as far back as the time when Jesus was around, or 2,000 years ago, etc. According to some of the experts, Michael Duver and Ed Carlson even, and others people that I was able to talk to, that is a little bit contested by the fact that most of the coring samples that they did, they were seeing trees, and the massive, massive trees that they see with topping out at 600 years old, maybe 700 years old. So you got to really watch it. I know there's a big issue with the senator tree in the center of the state of Florida. It's always been put down as 2,500 years old. That may not be the case, just so you know. But still, 400, 500, 600-year-old trees are not going to sprout up overnight, and especially if they are the key kind of environment for a host of animals to really be, using the cypress area. That's going to be a problem. Next photo. Here's a good close-up of the, this is a CJ, I think this is actually the locomotive that exists in Naples, Florida. So if you want to see one of these locomotives, you can go to the Collier County Historical Museum. And actually, I think this is one that's actually in Naples that was saved, moved over from the town of Copeland. Now, the process of logging cypress is very important. Let's focus first on what cypress was used for. During the period of time from the turn of the century, the 20s, 30s, 40s, even up to the 50s, primarily cypress lumber was used for pickle barrels, stadium seats, Coca-Cola crates, basically anything that would come in contact over and over again with any water or liquid. Because it grew in water, because it had properties that were protected by water, because it literally soaked up water, a good size cypress tree can sometimes hold, they say 400 or 500 gallons of water. Now, if you do the math there, every gallon is 8 pounds. That's a lot of water. So the first thing that the loggers would do is go out there with the axes that you see here and girdle the tree, meaning they literally put a notch, a V notch in the tree about sometimes 2 or 3 feet above the surface of the water. And then they would actually leave and take off, sometimes for a month or two, before they came back and actually cut the tree down. This allowed the tree to dry out and had most of the water leave the tree. I wouldn't say it leaked out and gushed out, but it definitely was a part of it. You have a lot of photos that show the girdling process. Once the tree actually fell, then they had to, if you could go back one shot, once the tree fell, you then had to top the tree off, meaning take all the nasty big branches that were coming off the top that was getting in the way of actually pulling this big log out of there. And depending on what the mill wanted that day or that month, they would cut it at places, at 20 feet, 30 feet, 40-foot planks, etc. And so this is what these folks were doing. Now look closely. You can see that they're also using their axes as a form of leverage to get a good bite and not to actually, get, when you're in the swamp, there's a lot of movement with being in the water and being in the muck. So you wanted to make sure that when you had the ebb and flow of the fulcrum of the saw, you had a good grip on it so you can pull back and push back, etc. But after a while, if you do the math, look at where that saw, crosscut saw is. The teeth of that saw are literally almost about 3 or 4 inches from the water line. And eventually, as you can see, that they're waist deep in water, that saw is going to be keep going underneath the water line. We do have it on occasion of different, I think I've interviewed close to about 18 loggers. And on more than one occasion, they told me there were moments at the very end of this process where they would take a good deep breath, go underwater and finish up that tree. Maybe there was only maybe an inch or 2 left, but they just couldn't get down deep enough to get to the right angle to cut it. So not easy. Now let's just pause and understand that you're also in waist deep water with alligators, snakes, the whole gamut of dangerous type stuff associated with the Everglades. So much so that in 1958, when the Saturday Evening Post did a story of the unknown loggers of the Cypress Swamp, they called the Cypress loggers the most toughest and probably most dangerous job in America by far at the time. There's also another reason when they hauled these logs out, they would take out a cable that was attached to tongs, and they would be set into those cypress logs, and overhead cables that were attached to other trees that they did not cut would then winch them back to the main line with these steam-powered cranes that did not have what you and I would call a soft throttle today, just inch and just make sure you got it just right and slowly move it. No, sometimes, folks, those logs would get caught up in snags and what have you, and those, you know, cables would be stretched to the point where occasionally those tongs would come off. And loggers told me there was a certain sound they knew when that went, that people just stopped everything and hit the floor, because now you have a cable being stretched out like a rubber band. That's a lethal item in the forest. Next photo. Here's a good detail of a crosscut saw. Now, one thing I was fascinated with, nothing really ever stopped at these logging towns. When the loggers who would get up sometimes at 5 in the morning, sometimes there was a, not sometimes, there was a whistle being blown, steam-powered whistle at the mill site or at the home site at Copeland. And that meant that in about an hour, the train was leaving. And if you weren't on it by 6 o'clock in the morning, you were going to miss work. But that didn't mean that everybody just went to sleep and waited to the next day. At night, unbeknownst to me on many of my research hours until I got to certain interviews, the crosscut saws, there was a team of people during the night that their whole job was to keep these saws sharp, okay? So as people slept, other workers came alive when they came back at the end of the day at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night to come to bed, and other people would be working all night to get those crosscut saws sharpened. You can imagine that was very important. Same with the axes and the locomotives. None of the locomotives could just get shut off and just leave it, and, you know, oh, we'll just start her up tomorrow morning. These steam-powered locomotives were very persnickety. You had to keep the boilers running, etc. So there was a crew just to handle that. Next slide. Here's a great shot, a detail, probably in central Florida. You can see at kind of where his hand is touching is the axe there, or at his waistline. You can see the girdling of the tree that we were talking about. Again, a 3 to 4 inch V notch cut out by an axe around the tree, and that would allow the tree to kind of dry out. But look at the tree in the front of the shot here. These were massive, massive trees, folks. There were occasions where we have photographs with loggers, as many as 5 of them standing shoulder to shoulder on the stump of a tree. So not a pretty sight, but just to let you know, and we'll get into why they were after those trees, even though before the war effort, they were considered logged out in the southern state of Florida. Next shot. Now, predominantly the loggers that were at the end of the line, I would say good probably 90, 95% were African-American loggers. During the war effort, during the war years, there were a lot of Seminole Indians and Miccosukee hired out there. But this is a gang that probably is coming back from work or reached the end of the line, is going out to the end of the spur line to go to work. And a lot of them came from Georgia and South Carolina. They put the word out pretty far to come down here. Next photo. This is a detailed shot of the colored section. Again, their words, not mine. And in that era, it was definitely very much segregation of both the towns of Copeland and Jerome, which were 2 of the biggest towns. Copeland is situated about 7 miles north of Everglades City on State Road 29. And about 5 or 6 miles north of Copeland, there is Jerome. That was another town, again, that was segregated. White and black, etc. Now, Copeland was more traditional in the sense that if you were an African-American worker, you were probably a logger. You were probably never going to be on the actual locomotive or have any managerial jobs. But that was not the case in the town of Jerome. C.J. Jones was far more kind of advanced or liberal or open-minded about those things, and there were opportunities given to African Americans at the town of Jerome that were just unheard of in the town of Copeland. And there's a famous story I'll share in just a second. But the next slide, I believe, shows a detail that Lee Cypress Tidewater Company, houses for rent, white and colored. As you can see, there's a distinction between white and colored. There was one sad episode where at the town of Jerome, there was an automobile accident that had slid down the Atlantic coastline, the ACL line canal that had made the road, State Road 29. And the driver of that automobile was an African-American gentleman, and it slipped into the canal, and he could not swim, and he drowned. Now, making that story even worse, but also illustrated into the type of man that C.J. Jones was, he went straight over to Fort Myers, where his son, C.J. Jones Jr., and this is a story told from C.J. Jones Jr. to me, he brought his kid out of school back to the town of Jerome, and he went to the site where this poor man had drowned, and he pointed to the, to the catastrophe in the car in the water, and he told his son, "You see what happened here? The son of a bitches that allowed this to happen," meaning there was apparently witnesses that allowed, could have helped, but didn't help, purportedly white witnesses. And he wanted his son to know that that was not the type of people that he wanted his son to be, or that he expected his town to be. And he was, really incensed by this needless death at this moment. But that just goes to show you that, and along with certain positions that were given to African Americans at Jerome, was a very different story. Nonetheless, most of the logging was done by African Americans. Now, when you got, that's okay, you can go to the next slide, the coins. When you were paid, which you actually were paid pretty well, most of the loggers I talked to said, the pay was really well. It was a long hours, hard work, etc. But there was a little twist in that. You were paid at the Lee Cypress Tidewater Company, town of Copeland. You were paid in something called Babbitt. Babbitt was basically company money. And here you see Jane's Company. It says Jane's in there. I forget the full name, but basically they had a store there at Copeland, Florida, across the street. But it was a company-owned store. So you were paid in Babbitt, and then you would be spending that money that you were being earned, or you would actually ask for some credit, and then it would be taken out of your pay. So it's kind of like a very, what I call a canned hunt, tricky situation. But that was not the case in interviewing Edwin Jones, C.J. Jones Jr.'s brother, C.J. Jones Sr.'s brother, who was the accountant. At the town of Jerome, you were paid in cash if you wanted. I think they did have some Babbitt, but you had the option of being paid in cash. Next slide. This one, if you look very closely, you can see this is the Lee Cypress Tidewater Company. Again, this is, you can see the crane in the back with a very good silhouette of the tongs. And I believe that, Sally, that you have uncovered in the middle of the swamp one of those big tongs that you can see in the background. In fact, if you have your little cursor, you can maybe even point to the tong that I'm talking about. It doesn't need to happen, but there you go. You guys look at the cursor, there's the tong there. Now that looks like a very tiny little ice cube picking tong, but those things are massive. I know that when Sally hands me that tong, when I go to give a talk at Corkscrew, you have to really put your back into it. This is not easy and not a lightweight. Next photograph. Now I put this photo in here. This is not cypress, the swamp cypress. This is a photograph taken by Lindsay Senecal from Maine. She takes these images where it kind of tricks the eye into thinking it's a toy or a model, but in fact this is a standard gauge rail line, but it's taken in such a way that it looks like a thin and narrow gauge. And the reason I put this up there, because it looks like a narrow gauge line. there were a lot of lines within the Big Cypress going off US 41, going off the Tamiami Trail, obviously, and the Loop Road that were put as a narrow gauge rail line. And first, the first narrow gauge line went from Everglades City to Deep Lake, was a narrow gauge. In fact, before it was a narrow gauge with steel, it was a narrow gauge with wooden cypress poles, etc. But a lot of the time, they were small locomotives or small, what we call contraptions, if you will, just to move small logs of lumber to and fro. Next photograph. And again, this is a good situation where you can see, unfortunately, the destruction of the Fakahatchee. You can see the royal palms obviously sticking up, and the rail line going through the swamp itself. I forget how many miles, but easily, I know that if you run the big marathon that they have through the big 50-mile marathon or 60-mile marathon through the Fakahatchee and through the Picayune Strand, I know that the main line, the Jane Scenic Drive, can go sometimes as many as 40 to 50 miles. And if you account for all the spur lines, folks, there were hundreds of miles of line of railroad tracks and iron that was put out there. Unbelievable amount of destruction to go out there and get to this cypress. There were times that the C.J. Jones Lumber Company put out lines outside going east of Jerome into the Big Cypress. If you go to Wagon Wheel Road, the corner of Wagon Wheel Road, and just pop out less than 100 feet, you're going to find ties that are still out there, and you're going to find pieces of rail, not full rail, but maybe connector piece. We found a few connector pieces of rail that would connect two pieces of long rail, and you'll find a lot of spikes sometimes still in those ties. Now, the ties they were putting out there, because they weren't going to be out there too long, actually were just logs that were split or cut in half, with the round side facing down into the swamp, the flat side up, and the rail would be put right on there. So quite a haphazard, just in the dry time of the year, hoping that they could get in and out very quickly. This is Tamiami Trail as it existed many, many moons ago, when a lot of people remember on one side of the street where the canal was, there was a lot of Australian pines. The Tamiami Trail also had a big impact in 1928 when it was finally opened, from 1915 to 1928 when it was built. That opened up a lot of land to logging, to just people having their homes out there in their cabins. And in many cases, there were a lot of small sawmills that were just regular sawmills that were placed in next to people's cabins. And when I started working at the Big Cypress, I remember seeing a file of just properties that had a small personal sawmill. So aside from the 2 or 3 massive ones and 4 or 5 or 6 medium sized, there were dozens of smaller personal sawmills out there. Next slide. And here is a very rare shot in the Fakahatchee. And again, this is number 1, is actually in the Naples Museum. Next photograph. I do want to add that pine was also taken out there. In fact, speaking of pine, this is a ravaged hurricane destroyed area of pines, and C.J. Jones had what we call a portable sawmill unit that was sent out to harvest pines that were damaged in a hurricane, and they didn't want sitting out there for an extended period of time. If you let the logs sit out there, and it would start rotting. But if you get out there quick after a hurricane, and you knew there was you wouldn't have to, half the battle was you wouldn't have to cut them down, they were already cut. But you had these contraptions that, as you look closely, folks, there is no safety mechanism anywhere here. If that saw would loosen up the bolt, that's going to go through the forest and do some major damage. So this is a hardy approach to life and work. Next shot. I just wanted to mention that the tallest of the pines were used for telephone poles. And the cypress lumber was actually used for PT boat manufacturing during the war effort. A lot of the hulls of PT boats were used or originally made with cypress. And actually that was the difference. You're looking here at a 66-inch round circular saw that was a mammoth one in Perry, Florida. And that's a cypress log there from the big cypress, shipped about 400 miles up the state of Florida over to Perry, and then being cut there. The war changed everything. Before World War II, it was simply too much of a big risk for companies to take to actually go into the cypress swamp, risking all the immense amount of money, material, and just the softness of the swamp in conjunction with the heavy locomotives. But the war changed that. The government told all these lumber companies, and they came as far away as Canada. The Cummer & Sons company came from Canada. Once they removed the risk and told these loggers, we'll pay you a certain flat amount, no matter how much you can get out there per board feet of lumber, that allowed these companies to go in there big time and minimize that risk. Next photo. This is a rare photograph of, on the right-hand side, the main mill at the town of Jerome. And on the left side, that white building is the kind of the powerhouse, the steam-powered powerhouse that would generate electricity for the town that we believe probably at the height by 1955, 56, probably had about 1,000 people. And there's a big smokestack there. And we're going to talk about the water tower, I think, in the next slide. And sure enough, here's the water tower of the town of Jerome. All that is really left in the town of Jerome are the concrete foundations to the feet of this big water tower. And there's one that's very easily kind of look-see. You can actually kind of sometimes have to go through some weeds, but about 100 feet from the roadside, you can actually see it. The other three are a little bit dug deeper into the forest there. But that's about all that's left. Next photograph. And back to the original one. Again, my research spanned about one summer, and then I came back to do another summer. But over the years, and really, it doesn't really stop. I still get information sent to me by different people. Hey, are you the Jerome guy? Are you the logging guy? Did you know this was out there? And recently, I even saw a black and white film that's on YouTube. Initially, it was a film out of Louisiana, which is very exciting to see cypress loggers in a setting like the big cypress, to kind of see how the process worked, to see them really moving. We also have some color views on film that the Jones family gave me. And then recently we found a film by a British company that was shot probably in the 40s that really show the big cypress loggers in the big cypress. Next photograph. And I just wanted to end with this slide, and then we're going to open it up to questions. But after Hurricane Irma, of course, there was a lot of damage throughout different parts of Florida. Here is a great big mahogany tree in the parking lot of the Anhinga Trail. Before there was logging for cypress and pine, mahogany, tropical mahogany was a big source of lumber to make all sorts of mahogany furniture, etc. I'm going to pause now and open it up to questions. It's usually when we have a question, we trip up into all sorts of things. So Sally, I'll open it up to you to feed me one question at a time.
Okay, Cesar, thank you. Some questions we got. Let's see. What was it like to work with all of the insects in the swamp?
Well, I'll tell you this, there was no off switch, and there was no season for going out and say, hey, you know what, I'll be back in the wintertime. This summer stuff's for the birds. No, they logged there pretty much all year round. The insects were horrible, but of course, you know, talking to these loggers, if you're out there every day, you kind of build up. These are, even when I met them in their 80s and in their 90s, you can just tell that, and I was out there in the summer, by the way, when I did this research. I was interviewing them outside in the summer, and most of the occasions, you know, I'd be on the other side quietly trying to swat mosquitoes, and they would just be like maybe a quick towel here or there around their neck, but you know, they wouldn't be bothered by it. They've been through everything, and case in point, even I, over the years, I used to go into the Everglades in the middle of the summer like an idiot with full mosquito gear and have my sandwich eating inside the suit, and you know, with a fanny pack around my waist, but everything inside the suit. And I would brush my hands off and there would be blood. I mean, it was crazy, but you know, I've seen mosquitoes even in deep in the Everglades in the middle of the summer with Tony Pernas, who came out to take me out on a buggy ride to see some tall stands of pineland. And he said we'd be back by noon, and the axle broke and we weren't back till 2 in the morning. So I've been around mosquitoes in the middle of the summer with no protection in shorts, and it's hell. I won't lie to you, but I think after a while, you just get used to it. And not to mention, there were times they told me in the winter months, getting off that train, there would be a small little thin crust of ice in the swamp floor. No kidding. So you had the complete opposite from heat and bugs to, whew, I'm certainly glad it's not buggy, but it's darn cold. And they had to get in that stuff. So, you know, we complain about things like hypothermia. I think these guys were just so hardy that they'd kind of laugh at those things. A good question.
Another question was, what year were most of those logging pictures taken, like the one with the royal palms in the beginning?
The majority of the heavy part of the logging starts in 1940 and ends around 1956, with, of course, a big influx around 1942, 43 when they're going full bore out there. The pictures were probably taken in the late 40s, early 50s. As I said, slowly, that line would go all the way to just about kissing, and really in the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, as the story goes, when folks were kind of waking up to the fact that, not waking up, they kind of were watching this, but they realized that like the last strand of the big trees were going to be threatened. You had a situation where the lawyers and the environmentalists and the Lee Cypress Tidewater Company were all dealing at a time that I can't say that they were being fully fair or using the faint din of electric saws and chainsaws. So some were electric, by the way, run off the line of a D4 tractor with a generator, and some were gasoline-powered chainsaws in the background. And they may or may not have been cutting trees per se, but keeping up that kind of threat that, you know, we better get this done quickly. And I don't want to fully, I mean, I haven't crossed all my T's and dotted my I, but I believe, Sally, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, they had to shake the trees for a lot of millions of dollars that they had to find. I think about close to $12 million or 2 or 3, I forget. But I think they went all the way up to a moment where they actually bothered Rockefeller at a lunch somewhere to ask him for money. You know, it went that far, you know, kind of like a scary 11th hour, you know, finalization of the contract that would finally, and what the Lee Cypress Tidewater Company finally did is they said, listen, we won't log the last of the bit, but our timber scout says there's so many board feet of lumber, and we'll sell it to you at a fair price. And so they were paid for what they would have basically cut and sold. I'll let Sally talk a little bit about what you remember.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened. A lot of people funded the project to protect the swamp at Corkscrew, and it was about $200,000 back in 1954 that was the selling price for the swamp. That was the value of the remaining timber that hadn't been logged and that has never been touched since at Corkscrew.
Thank goodness, thank goodness. So I forget what that 200,000 means today, but it's probably maybe $1 million or $2 million or something like that.
I'm not really sure.
Someone knows. I dove a little bit into that. I did give a talk about the founding of Corkscrew, but I'm a little more rusty on that than the main thrust of the main part of the story of the logging. But one day, as I told you, I think the marriage of the story of Corkscrew and the logging, hopefully, and there is, you know, I've been working on a book for many years, hopefully will come together with all of it all together. A good question. Go for it. What's the next question?
Other questions. Were royal palms harvested in Fakahatchee?
No, a lot of them were cut. Unfortunately, there are photos, not the ones that I showed you now, but there are photos where I see royal palms obviously were in the way, or, you know, in the way of the, you know, grade of the road or the line, and they were cut. I do know that royal palms in general were traded by the Seminole Indians, and in some cases the Women's Club of the Florida Federation of Women's Club, when they opened Royal Palm State Park, one of the things that they sold as a way to raise money to keep the park open before it was a national park, they would actually sell small royal palms that they would harvest out of the forest. So, you know, royal palm, and it's been said that a lot of the royal palms and that went to Fort Myers and Miami, et cetera, were brought out of the swamp. But I don't believe during this particular push there was a systematic anything of oh, let's take out a royal palm and sell it. I think they were too hungry to, not that my research shows during that time.
Okay. All right, another question. Are there any abandoned locomotives that are left behind anywhere?
Yes, there's a great couple of people that you can talk to. I haven't been taken to them personally, but I know that Chris Evans, a good friend of mine who does an incredible amount of hiking out in the Big Cypress, probably Matt Stock, who is focusing more on abandoned vehicles, although I think he's probably found the shell husk of, I think between them both and other people, Dale Mason and others have got their eyes out there. I found a lot of ties, and we actually did find a crosscut saw out there, connector pieces, spikes for sure, and a lot of wooden ties that are rotting out there. But most of the locomotives were scrapped and sold for different scrap, although there has to probably be a couple of them. And there were stories that definitely, and there's even photographs that I have of a locomotive on its side. But I haven't come across a full big intact one, which I assume once one went down, they would scrap it for scrap. But there is photographic evidence in the modern day age that was given to me, you know, as less than a month ago from Chris, that definitely show a small, maybe a narrow gauge locomotive out there.
Another related question was all the rail removed from the track that they laid out there?
Yeah, most rail was all removed because, you know, there's a very dramatic photograph at the town of Copeland with you know, sparks coming out of a acetylene torch, etc., removing all the rail, you know, and scrapping all that. And so all the rail was pretty much, but the connector pieces, these kind of foot and a half, 2 foot long pieces that would connect one piece of rail to another piece of 20, 30, 40 foot rail, we've actually wrenched some out of the swamp. So those were like, to them, it was like a little piece of staple, you know, minuscule. So they would leave them out there. But most of it was taken back. I do want to mention that the town of Jerome, the mill that you saw, came to a fiery, blazing end. I believe it was 1957 when the mill was being dismantled and it was going to be sold to an outfit in Brazil, a logging outfit in Brazil. And C.J. Jones was going to sell them all the planing mills and sawmills and the whole machinery. The mill was being taken apart, and as the story goes, a spark from an acetylene torch hit a dust-laden pile of wood shavings that was oil, you know, kind of had grease or oil, and the whole place just went up so quickly and so massively that folks said that they could see the blaze from as far away as Fort Myers. So, and I think it burned for like a day. And there is photographic representation in the newspapers about that blaze. So 1957, we believe, is the true ending of the big behemoths of logging. However, into the 60s and 70s, along the loop road, there was what we call sliding or truck logging, or sliding the logs out. Using D4 tractors and trucks, etc., to get the mainly pine out of the big cypress. Big cypress, yeah.
Okay. Another question is, can you estimate the amount of lumber harvested pre and post World War II?
Pre-World War II?
And post.
No, as much as you hear me drop a lot of numbers here and there, I can't say with a good conscience that I've studied the heck out of. Now it is out there, and I remember in my collection at FIU, most of all of this, a small part of it went to, of course, Big Cypress, and they kept what they wanted to keep, and then I kept for many years, as people keep sending me stuff, a lot of information that was later donated to FIU. There was a couple of things that I definitely saw from the state of Florida's point of view, statistics, etc., of pine. So there is definitive numbers we can go gather. I haven't focused on that. There was a lot of lumber mills in Dade County in South Florida, inside Everglades National Park, that Dan Beard wrote about in 1938 for his 39 report on the park. There was a lot of the Maxey sawmill and the Reynolds sawmill. There's a lot of banter of which one was this one called, and a lot of times they're swapped on maps and they're not the exact name to it. So it's it's a tricky situation but the two big ones that we definitely know that we have a lot of information on are, again, of Copeland, which is pretty much not a full ghost town today, but not a shell of what it once was, and Jerome, which is a bona fide kind of a ghost town. I think there's only one or two houses still inhabitedly living, at Jerome, but the town has been, pretty much erased.
We still have questions coming in. Another one is, where can people see old growth cypress? That's remaining.
Well, two places. A little place called, let me see, Corkscrew? Yeah, Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Of course, the best and the brightest, and some of them are so big they have names and stories. You've actually named some of these big ones. But also Big Cypress Bend off the coast, off the Tamiami Trail, about 10-ish miles from State Road 29, west of State Road 29 as it crosses the trail on Tamiami Trail. Near Collier State Seminole Park is a place called Big Cypress Bend. There are some trees that are matching the ones you have there, but the big ones, and then there's one big one that has kind of been hit by arson, unfortunately, the Senator in the central Florida near Oviedo or north of Orlando.
Where did the loggers go after they were finished logging in this area?
Interesting question. Some actually stayed in the town of Jerome. Gentleman named Graham, old man Graham. Graham. I think his name is Graham. I interviewed him. He was still there into his 90s when he died. Monroe Graham, old man Monroe Graham. I interviewed a lot in Fort Myers, some of them in Immokalee. So they kind of took off in different places. Once the town of Jerome shut down, people really pretty much took off. Some went to Everglades City, and others went back home to Georgia, South Carolina, all over the place.
Okay. Cool. Did anyone ever mention Ivory-Billed Woodpeckers that were seen in the area back then in all your studies? Yeah,
I mean, the bird life, there was definitely, a situation where you were literally in their backyard at a time where the population was much healthier. Certainly not anywhere near the turn of the century, but still enough that today, if we were to turn back the time and go back to 1942 Fakahatchee, it would almost be like, holy moly, I can't believe how many birds there are here, I don't know exactly what they saw, but they definitely mentioned, the bird life, the animal life, bears, panthers. There was a very big story once of the locomotive dying out in the middle of nowhere, and the guys all got back on the track and walked their way home, and were just kind of going around this bend when they got the locomotive working. And as they picked up the people on the way back, they picked up the last guy, and around the bend, as they rounded the bend, the light on the front of the locomotive caught the eyes of a panther sitting right there waiting, basically. And who knows what would have happened in those days. Maybe the panther was waiting. But certainly there were times that everything was right around you.
Right. Okay. Another question, why are the trees only 700 years old? Was it due to a fire?
That's a great question for Michael Duver, who is, a great friend of yours, I know. And again, I am not on the natural end expert to handle, and when there is questions like that, I don't want to say, I forget what he told me, but I do remember him telling me two things about cypress trees. It is not fully definitive yet, 180% of what the cypress knees really do. And also it has been kind of understood that there's not, trees that were 2,000, 3,000 years old, apparently. That the most he saw was at like the 600 year. Again, it's a long time ago, but that's what I remember him telling me.
Yeah, that's consistent with what I've heard him say.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Another question, was yellow fever a problem for loggers?
No, it could have been, but that was a little bit earlier in the process. We did have an outbreak of yellow fever in 1898, I believe, during the Spanish-American War. Don't quote me on that, but somewhere before the turn of the century, there was a rash of it coming out, and it was down here. But, and I could be wrong on the date on that one, but not to my knowledge. I didn't hear any yellow fever epidemics or anything like that. No.
Okay. All right. What did the workers eat? Did they have a good food supply? Were they fed food, or did they have to make their own?
They apparently ate very well, because, you had the game right around you, deer, wild hog, barbecues, you name it. There were great things for entertainment. Both towns purportedly had what we call a juke joint. Definitely at the town of Jerome, because the juke joint was partially operated by, the movies, when they showed movies, was operated by C.J. Jones Jr. The juke joint was operated by this one particular guy. I remember is in my report. But, that was a happening scene: music, fun, dance, drinking, rowdiness, and the whole 9 yards, a couple of fist fights, the whole 9 yards. But from what I'm told, they ate very well. They did have a store that they could buy just about anything you would want to have. And you had to pretty much provide the full, even the town of Jerome had electricity. I don't think it was on 24/7, but it definitely had, electricity parts of the night, in the morning, etc. Okay.
All right. We're running out of time, but I'll ask one last question, then we'll wrap it up. The last question is the broken down bridge south of Oil Well Road, just west of Ave Maria, part of the old rail line? Are you familiar with that?
I believe it is. And I think I know the one they're talking about, but I don't want to completely say 100%. I'm going to have to take a rain check on that. However, I do want to say this. If anybody has any further questions on logging or anything in the Everglades, it's a long email, but it's easy to remember. takethefuturecamping@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer any questions at takethefuturecamping@gmail.com, or send questions through Sally. I can get back to you on that one. It's been a long time. I think I know the one she's talking about, but I can't with full effect. But a lot of the trestle bridge type bridge you see out there are probably, rail lines. I know there was a piece of it you could see coming up across the the Barren River and coming into Everglades City, across the Tamiami Trail, right as you get to Carnstown. You can see the remnants of, kind of right before it gets to the trail of those Australian pines. That's where the highland of the rail, crossing of the canal. So, there were a lot of those places. In fact, just building the Tamiami Trail had to have an immense amount of lumber because of the different bridges that had to be built or the corduroy roads that had to be built just for colliers purposes. So, before there was logging on a big scale, it was still logging on a big scale, even for the construction of the Tamiami Trail.
Well, thank you very much, Cesar, and thank you for giving me email address. And like Cesar mentioned, I'd be happy to take questions. Just email me, and you can find my email address on the Corkscrew website. Again, this will be recorded, and we'll send you all the link when we have it. Thank you again.
Take care.